Hello, welcome to the How Do I series for Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2013 R2. My name is Jared Conroy and I am a Microsoft Dynamics NAV escalation engineer. In this video, I will present how do I migrate from a single tenant NAV 2013 database to NAV 2013 R2 with a multi-tenancy architecture. At the end of this video, you will be familiar with the tools available within the Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2013 R2 product for transitioning to a multi-tenant architecture. With the R2 release, you now have the option of separating the NAV application from your business data. You will also see how to create a new empty tenant database in SQL Server and populate it with existing company data or with a brand new company. The objectives of this video are: 1. To review a typical NAV 2013 database which includes multiple companies and prepare to migrate this to a NAV 2013 R2 multi-tenant environment. 2. Create a separate database and move the NAV application objects into it. 3. Create a new tenant database and move one of the companies into it. 4. Create another new tenant database and then populate it with a new company. Please note that for the purposes of this how-to video, we assume that the NAV 2013 database has already been upgraded to NAV 2013 R2. This means we can focus on the steps involved in restructuring the NAV database in order to take advantage of the new multi-tenancy architecture which has been introduced with NAV 2013 R2. This slide shows the steps we will be following during the rest of this video. In step 1, we will summarize the planned operation. We will take a backup of the NAV 2013 multi-company database before we start. We will make sure that we have adequate permissions at the operating system level and SQL Server level. In step 2, we will create an application database and move all of the application objects from the NAV database into this new database. We will then mount the new application database and also the tenant database, which still contains the two companies. We will also persist the new configuration settings for the NAV service tier so that it will automatically mount the application database and the tenant database at startup. In step 3, we will create and mount a new empty tenant database and then move a company from the original tenant database into this new tenant database. We will then access both tenant databases with the Dynamics NAV Windows client. In step 4, we will create and mount another new tenant database, and this time we will create a new company in the empty tenant database. At this stage, let's take a conceptual look at the difference between NAV 2013 and NAV 2013 R2 from the perspective of a multi-tenancy environment. On this slide, you can see how something like a multi-tenancy environment could be created using Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2013 before the R2 release, which has native support for a true multi-tenant database structure. Note that each tenant would have to be implemented by a separate instance of Dynamics NAV. Also, all of the application objects would be stored in each tenant-like database. Here you can see how a true multi-tenancy architecture is possible with NAV 2013 R2. All three tenants can be implemented on a single instance of Dynamics NAV, although you also have the option of using more than one instance where required. Notice that there is just one single copy of the application objects, and this can be kept in a separate database. The application objects are shared by all of the tenant databases. When the NAV 2013 R2 demo is installed, it uses one single database for the application DB and the tenant DB. Logically, for the NAV server, these are two separate databases. However, physically, they are stored in the same SQL Server database to ensure that users who prefer not to use the multi-tenancy mode can continue working with a single database as with earlier versions of Dynamics NAV. For the purpose of this video, I am starting the migration process with the demo Cronus database, which contains all of the NAV application objects plus two companies in a single SQL Server database. Over the next few minutes, you will see the steps involved to achieve the following. 1. Splitting out the NAV application objects into a separate application database, thus making the original NAV database a tenant database containing 2 companies. 2. Moving the second company into a separate tenant database so that the original NAV database will only contain a single company. 3. Creating a new empty tenant database and deploying a third company into it. 4. Saving the tenant configuration details so that both of the new tenant databases are mounted automatically when the NAV middle tier is started. Before starting this process, make sure that you are using a Windows login which has local administrator rights on your machine. Also, make sure that the corresponding SQL Server login is a member of the sysadmin SQL Server role. Finally, if you are trying these steps on a real NAV database, I would recommend taking a SQL Server backup of the database before proceeding. We are now ready for step 2, where we create a separate NAV application database. Let's get started by opening the Microsoft Dynamics NAV administration tool, making sure we use Run as Administrator, like this. Use this PowerShell commandlet to stop the NAV middle tier service. Next, export the Microsoft Dynamics NAV application objects into a separate database using this commandlet. Note that this will create the new application database in SQL Server and will also create the required permissions for the Dynamics NAV middle tier service account, that is, membership of the DB owner database role. Now that we know that this command has succeeded, we can remove the Microsoft Dynamics NAV application objects from the original NAV database with this command. At this stage, it is important to update the NAV middle tier configuration file appropriately so that it is configured to use a tenant database structure. We can do this simply by running this commandlet. We can now restart the Microsoft Dynamics NAV server. When the service is running, we can then mount the new application database. Mounting a database makes it available to the Dynamics NAV middle tier service. Next, we want to mount the original Cronus database, which now contains only the 2 companies without any application objects. That is, it is now a tenant database. This commandlet will do the required mount operation. At this stage, we have accomplished what we set out to do in step 2. The application objects are now residing in a separate SQL Server database from the business objects, which belong to the 2 NAV companies. The 2 companies are now in a tenant database, and the following commandlet will save the current tenant configuration information for use by the NAV middle tier service. Now, let's access our NAV data using the Windows client to prove that it all hangs together as expected. Note that the Windows client now requires a tenant ID in the connection string. In our case, the tenant ID is default. Note that we can see our 2 companies inside the database. By opening the NAV development environment, we are connecting to the application database, which contains the NAV objects which are shared by all tenant databases. On this slide, you can see the system tables which are created in the application database as compared to the system tables created in a tenant database. Let's take a look at this in SQL Server Management Studio by comparing the system tables in the new application database with the system tables in the tenant database. On this slide, we can see a brief summary of the major steps we just carried out to create a dedicated application database. We stopped the middle tier service using the set nav server instance commandlet in the NAV administration shell. We updated the middle tier configuration file using the set nav server configuration commandlet to make NAV aware that we are using a multi-tenancy configuration. We exported the NAV application objects into a dedicated database using the export NAV application commandlet. We then removed the NAV application objects from the original NAV database using the remove NAV application commandlet. Finally, we restarted the NAV service and mounted the application database and the tenant database using the set NAV server instance, mount NAV application and mount NAV tenant commandlets. At the moment, we have a single tenant database which contains two companies. The next step we are about to carry out involves moving one of the companies from the tenant database into a separate tenant database. Therefore, at the end of this step, our NAV environment will include two tenant databases, each of which will contain a single company. Before starting step 3, I will need to import a PowerShell script module from the samples provided in the NAV 2013 R2 installation media. I can import this PowerShell script file into the Dynamics NAV administration shell tool with this command. I can now move a company to a new tenant database like this. Notice the final parameter on the commandlet we just executed. Remove company when moved equals 1. This causes the commandlet to delete the company from the old tenant database after it has been successfully copied to the new tenant. In fact, remove company when moved equals 1 is the default behavior for this commandlet, so I could have omitted this parameter. However, if you want to copy a company from one tenant database to another so that you have a duplicate copy of the company, then you can run this command with remove company when moved equals 0. Doing this means that we can effectively create a backup of the company in NAV 2013 R2, which is equivalent to the way we could create a company backup in an FBK file using earlier versions of Dynamics NAV. Now let's access both of the existing companies using the NAV Windows client. Now we come to step 4, where we create a third tenant database and then set up a new company in our new tenant database. The first thing I need to do is to create a new empty database using SQL Server Management Studio. At this stage, we should make sure that the NAV middle tier service account, for example the network service, is included in the DB owner database role within the newly created tenant database. I now need to run the command script to mount the new tenant database. At this stage, I can create the new company in the empty tenant database like this. Now that this command has succeeded, we should be able to access our new company using the Windows client, so let's give that a try. Everything is working as expected, so we should persist the current tenant configuration by running this PowerShell commandlet. To see the effect of this commandlet, let's take a look at the tenants.config file. If you are following this process using live data, now would be a good time to take a SQL Server backup of each of the relevant databases. So let's review how far we've come in this how-to video. In step 1, we saw how to take an initial backup of the NAV 2013 multi-company database. We made sure our Windows login had adequate permissions at the operating system level and the SQL Server level. In step 2, we created an application database and moved all of the application objects from the NAV database into this separate application database. We mounted the new application database and also the remaining tenant database, which contained the two companies which were in the old NAV 2013 database. We persisted the new configuration settings so that the NAV service tier would automatically mount the application and tenant database at startup. In step 3, we created and mounted a new empty tenant database and then moved a company from the original tenant database into our new tenant database. After that, we accessed both tenant databases with the Dynamics NAV Windows client. Finally, in step 4, we created and mounted another new tenant database, and this time we created a new company in the new empty tenant database. For more information about multi-tenancy, please refer to the Dynamics NAV Developer and IT Pro Help file, which is installed with Dynamics NAV 2013 R2. This completes our video. How do I migrate from a single tenant NAV 2013 database to NAV 2013 R2 with a multi-tenancy architecture? Thanks for watching, and I wish you well as you proceed with using the new multi-tenancy functionality with Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2013 R2.